It started innocently enough. I wasn't snooping, I swear. I was tidying up the living room when I noticed his gym bag by the couch. It had been there for days and I figured I'd just put it away. As I picked it up, the zipper came undone slightly, and that's when I saw it. A small, elegant velvet box tucked into one of the side pockets. My heart skipped a beat. The kind of box you see in movies when someone gets down on one knee. The kind of box that could only hold something precious. A smile crept onto my face before I could stop it. I carefully pulled the box out and opened it. Inside was a necklace. Not just any necklace. A stunning silver pendant with a single flawless sapphire in the center, surrounded by tiny glittering diamonds. My breath hitched. It was perfect. Dainty, elegant, and unmistakably expensive. My thoughts immediately raced. He must have gotten this for me. Maybe it was a belated birthday surprise? My birthday had been just last week, and though he had taken me out to dinner, there was no big gift, no moment of romance beyond the usual. I closed the box and put it back exactly where I found it, careful not to disturb anything. I didn't want to ruin the surprise. My heart was light the rest of the day. I imagined him handing me the necklace with a shy smile, telling me how much I meant to him. Maybe he'd been waiting for the right moment, I thought. Maybe tonight. But tonight came and went. So did the next night. And the next. Days turned into a week. My excitement began to wane, replaced by confusion and eventually, a gnawing sense of unease. The box remained in the back of my mind, a constant whisper that something wasn't right. I told myself to be patient, that he'd surprise me when I least expected it. But deep down, doubts began to grow. Why would he wait this long? Then on a mundane Tuesday afternoon, everything unraveled. I was at his office for a quick coffee run, something I'd done countless times before. As I approached the break room, my eyes caught a glint of something familiar. It took a moment to register, but when it did, my heart dropped. The necklace. My necklace. The same sapphire pendant with diamond accents. But it wasn't on my neck. It was on hers. Her name was Rebecca. She was one of his co-workers, pretty in an effortless way, with a bubbly laugh and an easy charm that made her the center of attention in any room. I froze, staring at the pendant as it sparkled against her blouse. A million thoughts raced through my mind, each more devastating than the last. No, this couldn't be. There had to be some explanation. I forced myself to move, to breathe. My legs carried me toward her, though I wasn't sure what I intended to do. Confront her? Demand answers? My voice when it came was eerily calm. Beautiful necklace, I said, my tone even. Where did you get it? Rebecca beamed, her fingers instinctively reaching up to touch the pendant. Oh, this, she said, her eyes lighting up. It's a gift. From someone who values me more than anyone else in the world. The room seemed to tilt. Her words hung in the air, heavy and damning. I didn't need to ask who she was talking about. I already knew. I nodded, my face a mask of composure. It's stunning, I managed to say, though my throat felt like sandpaper. She smiled again, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I left the office without saying goodbye. My hands were shaking as I got into my car. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The pieces clicked into place with cruel clarity. The dinner that felt obligatory. The late nights at the office. The lack of warmth in his touch. And now this. The necklace wasn't for me. It was never for me. I went home and waited. When he walked through the door that evening, I watched him closely, searching his face for any sign of guilt. But he greeted me with the same easy smile he always wore, like nothing was wrong. Like our life wasn't built on a lie. I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, I began to notice everything I hadn't seen before. The way his phone was always face down. The sudden bursts of laughter when he was texting. The way he avoided looking me in the eye when I asked about his day. The betrayal burned sharp and relentless. But even as my world crumbled around me, I held on to one thought. He didn't know that I knew. And that gave me power. For now I'd let him think he had the upper hand. But the truth had a way of surfacing, and when it did, I'd be ready. That night I barely slept. My mind was a storm of questions and scenarios. How long had this been going on? Was she the first? Did he love her? Or was it just some fleeting infatuation? The answers didn't matter as much as the cold, hard facts staring me in the face. He had chosen her. Not just in some abstract emotional way but in the most tangible one. He bought her something beautiful, something meaningful, while leaving me with crumbs. The next morning I went about my routine like nothing was wrong. I made coffee, kissed him goodbye, and watched him walk out the door as if he weren't taking my heart with him. But beneath the surface, every small interaction felt hollow. Each smile, each laugh, each touch. Everything between us had been tainted by that necklace. Over the following days, I became hyper-aware of his habits. I didn't just watch, I studied. I noticed how often he worked late, or how he'd step outside to take a call, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Once I caught him smiling at a text, the kind of smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. He was careful but not careful enough. And I was determined to know everything. One evening, while he was in the shower, I finally gave in to the temptation I'd been resisting. I took his phone. My hands trembled as I unlocked it. He had once shared his password with me without hesitation. Back when trust wasn't just a word we threw around like confetti. The messages were there, plain as day. Rebecca. Her name glared at me like a neon sign. The texts weren't overtly romantic, but they didn't need to be. They were filled with inside jokes, little winks, and far too many emojis for a man who claimed to hate them. Then there were the pictures, selfies of her at her desk, a candid shot of her laughing at what I could only assume was his joke, and one of her wearing the necklace. My chest tightened as I scrolled through their digital intimacy, a world I wasn't a part of. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone, to confront him right there in the steam-filled bathroom. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I started planning. For days, I played the part of the oblivious wife. I cooked his favorite meals, laughed at his jokes, and even initiated conversations about his work, asking about Rebecca with feigned nonchalance. Each time her name came up, I watched his reaction carefully. He was good, too good. But there were cracks. A slight hesitation before answering. A shift in his tone. I decided that if he wasn't going to give me the truth, I'd take it. One Friday evening when he told me he'd be working late again, I followed him. I waited until he left the house, then grabbed my coat and slipped into my car. My heart raced as I trailed him through the streets, keeping a safe distance. I told myself I might be wrong, that this might all be some horrible misunderstanding. But deep down I knew better. He didn't go to the office. Instead, he drove to a small, cozy restaurant on the other side of town, a place we'd never been to together. I parked a block away and walked, my breath visible in the crisp night air. Through the window I saw them, him and Rebecca, seated at a corner table leaning in close. Her hand rested lightly on his arm as she laughed at something he said. The pendant caught the light, its sapphire glowing like a beacon of betrayal. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching the man I'd shared a life with share a part of himself with someone else. My mind was blank, my body frozen. It wasn't until the waiter brought them dessert, 2 spoons, 1 plate, that I turned and walked away. That night I didn't cry. I didn't scream or throw things or demand answers. Instead, I sat in our quiet house, staring at the walls that had once felt like a home. My anger simmered just beneath the surface, cold and calculated. If he thought I was going to sit back and let him destroy everything we'd built, he was wrong. Over the next week, I laid the groundwork. I gathered evidence, screenshots of messages, photos of them together, receipts I found tucked away in his coat pocket. I contacted a lawyer, someone discreet but sharp, and started exploring my options. If he wanted to throw our marriage away, I would make sure he paid the price. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal. Smiling when he came home, asking about his day, even kissing him goodnight. Each interaction felt like a performance, but I was determined to see it through. I wanted him to think he was safe, that his secrets were still his own. But secrets have a way of unraveling, no matter how tightly you try to hold them together. And when the time came, I'd be ready to pull the thread. The day I decided to confront him was carefully chosen. It wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, methodical, the culmination of weeks of holding back my anger and pain. It was a Saturday morning, the kind we usually spent lounging around the house, sipping coffee and reading the paper. He was in a good mood, smiling as he scrolled through his phone at the kitchen table, completely unaware that his world was about to tilt on its axis. I placed a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down across the table. My hands were steady, my expression calm. He glanced up at me, his smile faltering slightly when he noticed the intensity in my gaze. "We need to talk," I said, my voice even. He frowned, setting his phone down. "What's wrong?" I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "I've been noticing some things lately, things that don't add up. And I think it's time you told me the truth." His confusion was convincing, almost impressive. "What are you talking about?" I didn't say anything at first. Instead, I reached into the drawer next to me and pulled out the velvet box. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment I saw it, the flash of guilt, the panic he tried to mask. I opened the box and placed it on the table between us, the necklace gleaming under the soft kitchen light. "This," I said simply. "I found it weeks ago. First I thought it was for me, but then I realized it wasn't." He stared at the necklace, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, his voice was measured. "Where did you find that?" "In your gym bag," I replied, my tone sharp. "The same place I found the receipts. The same place you've been hiding everything." He opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. "Don't lie to me. I've seen it. I've seen her." "I know." The silence that followed was deafening. His shoulders sagged slightly, his composure slipping. "It's not what you think," he began, but I held up a hand. "Don't insult me," I said, my voice rising. "I saw her wearing it, right there in your office. She told me it was a gift from someone who values her more than anyone else. Does that sound familiar to you?" He flinched, his face pale. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, my anger finally spilling over. "Explain how you betrayed me? How you chose her over me? How you've been lying to my face every single day?" He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. "It's not that simple," he said, his voice desperate. "Rebecca and it just happened. I didn't mean for it to." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and foreign even to my ears. "It just happened? That's your excuse? You didn't mean to cheat on me, but you meant to buy her this, didn't you?" I gestured to the necklace. "You meant to take her out, to send her texts, to laugh with her while I sat at home thinking you were working late." He buried his face in his hands, and for a moment I thought he might cry. But I didn't feel sorry for him. Not even a little. "I made a mistake," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, congratulations," I said coldly. "You succeeded anyway." The rest of the conversation was a blur of accusations and weak defenses, each word cutting deeper than the last. By the end of it, I felt hollow, as though the last of my energy had been drained. He begged me to give him another chance, to let him prove that he could be better. But his words rang hollow, echoing in the empty space where my trust had once been. Over the next few days, I avoided him as much as possible. He stayed in the guest room, a silent acknowledgement of the rift between us. I threw myself into work, into anything that would distract me from the weight of his betrayal. But no matter how hard I tried, the memories of our life together kept creeping in, unbidden and unwelcome. I thought about the early days of our relationship, when everything had felt so simple, so full of promise. I thought about the nights we spent talking until dawn, the vacations, the inside jokes, the plans we'd made for the future. All of it felt like a cruel joke now, a beautiful illusion shattered by his selfishness. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the necklace still sitting on the coffee table like a mocking reminder, I realized something. I didn't have to decide anything right away. I didn't have to forgive him, and I didn't have to leave him. What I did have to do was take care of myself, to figure out who I was without him, and what I wanted my life to look like moving forward. So I packed a bag. When he came home that night, I told him I was leaving for a while. He didn't argue, didn't try to stop me. He just stood there looking lost and broken as I walked out the door. I didn't know where I was going or how long I'd be gone. All I knew was that I needed space to breathe, to think, to heal. As I drove away, the weight on my chest began to lift, replaced by something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Hope that one day I'd find my way back to myself. The first few days away felt surreal, as though I were floating through someone else's life. I checked into a small bed and breakfast on the edge of town, its cozy rooms and quiet surroundings a stark contrast to the chaos swirling inside me. The owners, an elderly couple with kind smiles, didn't ask questions, and for that I was grateful. I spent my days walking along nearby trails, letting the crisp air and the rustling leaves fill the spaces where my thoughts would otherwise spiral. Nights were harder. The silence of the room pressed in on me, bringing with it memories I was trying to escape. His laughter, his touch, the way he used to look at me when he thought I wasn't watching. On the third evening, I found myself sitting by the window, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, staring out at the darkened street. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I knew without looking who it was. He'd been calling and texting every day, leaving voicemails that I couldn't bring myself to listen to. But this time I picked up the phone and stared at the screen. His name glowed back at me. A name that once felt like home and now felt like a question I couldn't answer. I let the call go to voicemail again, but this time I played the message. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as though he knew he no longer had the right to ask for my attention. "I know you don't want to hear from me," he began, "and I don't blame you. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back. And if you never come home, I'll understand. But if there's even a chance, if there's anything I can do to make this right, I'll spend the rest of my life trying." I ended the message before it was finished. His words felt like an intrusion, a reminder of the life I'd walked away from and wasn't ready to face. I set the phone down and curled up on the bed, letting the tears I'd been holding back finally spill over. It wasn't the message itself that broke me. It was the realization that, despite everything, a small part of me still wanted to believe him. The next morning, I decided to do something different. Instead of retreating into my thoughts, I drove into the small town nearby and wandered through its streets, letting myself get lost among its quaint shops and bustling cafes. I found a bookstore tucked into a corner, its shelves crammed with everything from dog-eared paperbacks to pristine first editions. The smell of old paper and leather bindings was comforting, and I spent hours browsing, letting the words of strangers pull me out of my own story. It was there that I met someone unexpected. He was behind the counter, a tall man with dark hair streaked with silver at the temples and a quiet, thoughtful air about him. He noticed the book in my hands, a well-worn collection of poetry, and smiled. "Good choice," he said. His voice was warm, inviting, the kind of voice that made you feel like you were being let in on a secret. I smiled back a little shy. "I've always loved poetry," I admitted. "It's grounding." He nodded, his eyes kind. "It has a way of putting things into perspective, doesn't it? Like it's saying everything you feel but didn't know how to say." I nodded, and for the first time in weeks I felt a flicker of connection, of something outside my own pain. We talked for a while about books, about the town, about nothing in particular. His name was Mark, and he owned the shop, having inherited it from his parents years ago. There was an ease to our conversation, a sense of being seen without judgment or expectation. When I left, book in hand, I felt lighter, as though a small crack of light had found its way through the darkness. Over the next few days, I returned to the bookstore, finding excuses to linger among the shelves and talk to Mark. He never pried, never asked why I was there, or what had brought me to this quiet corner of the world. Instead, he shared stories about the town, about the books that lined his shelves, about his late wife who had loved poetry as much as I did. There was a gentleness to him, a steadiness that felt like an anchor in a sea of uncertainty. It wasn't romantic, at least not in the way I'd once understood romance. It was something simpler, quieter. A reminder that there was life beyond betrayal, that there were people who could offer kindness without expecting anything in return. One evening, as we sat on a bench outside the shop, watching the sun set over the rooftops, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You don't have to tell me," he said. "But whatever it is you're running from, it doesn't define you. You get to decide what happens next." His words stayed with me long after I'd gone back to the bed and breakfast. That night, I pulled out a notebook I'd bought on a whim and started writing. I wrote about the necklace, about Rebecca, about the way my world had shattered and the pieces I was trying to pick up. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the words blurred on the page, until the weight inside me felt just a little bit lighter. Day by day, I began to feel more like myself. Not the person I'd been before, but someone new, someone stronger. I didn't know what the future held, whether I'd go back to him or forge a path on my own. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed that I could choose, that I had the power to write the next chapter of my life, and that it didn't have to be defined by his betrayal. And that in itself was enough. As the days turned into weeks, the small town began to feel less like a place I had escaped to and more like a refuge, a space where I could rebuild myself piece by piece. My mornings became a quiet ritual, a walk through the forest trails that bordered the bed and breakfast, followed by coffee at a little cafe with mismatched chairs and a friendly barista who had started remembering my order. Afternoons were often spent at the bookstore, losing myself in stories that felt far removed from my own. And in the evenings I'd sit by the window in my room, writing in the notebook that had quickly filled with thoughts, questions, and fragments of a life I was trying to make sense of. Mark had become something of a steady presence in my days. He never pressed for details about my situation, but he seemed to sense when I needed distraction or quiet company. Sometimes we'd talk about books or share stories from our pasts, his filled with the bittersweet memories of a love he'd lost too soon, mine increasingly tinged with the clarity that comes from stepping back and seeing things for what they truly are. Other times we'd simply sit in companionable silence, the air between us calm and unhurried. One afternoon, as I was flipping through a poetry anthology at the shop, he appeared with 2 cups of tea and set one down beside me. "You've been coming here for a while now," he said, his tone light but his eyes thoughtful. "Do you ever feel like this place is starting to feel like home?" I considered his question, turning it over in my mind. "Maybe," I said finally. "But I think it's less about the place and more about the stillness. There's something about being here that makes it easier to think, to breathe." He nodded, his gaze steady. "Stillness can be a gift. Sometimes it's the only way to hear what you really need to." His words stayed with me long after I left the shop that day. It was true, the stillness of this place, of my new routine, had given me a clarity I hadn't had in years. I began to realize how much of myself I had lost in my marriage, how many compromises I had made, not just for him but for the image of a life I thought I wanted. The betrayal had shattered that image, but in the cracks I was starting to see glimpses of something else, something real. One evening, as I sat on the bed with my notebook open, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't him. It was a text from my best friend, Emily. She had been checking in periodically, offering her unwavering support without prying. This message was simple. "Whenever you're ready, I'm here." I stared at the words, a lump forming in my throat. Emily had always been my rock, the one person who knew me better than anyone else. But in the chaos of everything that had happened, I had pulled away from her, too afraid to admit just how broken I felt. Now, though I realized I didn't have to face this alone, the next day I called her. As soon as she picked up, her familiar voice filled the line, warm and concerned. "Hey," she said. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." I laughed, the sound surprising even myself. "I could never forget about you." For the first time since I'd left, I told her everything. About the necklace, about Rebecca. About the suffocating weight of pretending I didn't know. About the moment I walked away and the fragile steps I was taking to rebuild. She listened without interrupting, her quiet presence on the other end of the line a reminder of the kind of love that didn't need grand gestures or perfect timing. It was just there, steady and unconditional. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then she said, "I'm proud of you. For leaving. For putting yourself first." Her words hit me like a wave and I realized she was right. For all the pain and uncertainty, leaving had been the first real act of self-love I had given myself in years. It wasn't easy and it wasn't without its doubts, but it was mine. After that conversation, I started thinking more about what it meant to move forward. Not just away from the betrayal but towards something new. I began exploring the idea of staying in the town longer than I had planned, of finding work or maybe even a place of my own. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. A reminder that my life didn't have to be tied to the wreckage of what had been. One afternoon, as I sat at the cafe with my notebook, Mark appeared again, this time with a small stack of books. "I thought you might like these," he said, setting them down. "They're about finding your way back to yourself. No pressure, but they helped me once." I smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you," I said softly. "I think I could use all the help I can get." He sat down across from me, his expression thoughtful. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "Sometimes it takes losing everything to realize what you're truly capable of." His words resonated in a way that felt almost physical, as though he had seen the part of me I was still struggling to believe in. For the first time in a long time I felt a flicker of hope. Not just that I could survive this, but that I could come out of it stronger, more whole, more me. The days continued to pass, each one a small step forward. I didn't know exactly where the path would lead, but for the first time I wasn't afraid of not knowing. The stillness, the solitude, the quiet connections I was building. All of it was teaching me that I didn't need someone else to define my worth. It was something I could find within myself. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift of all. Weeks turned into a month, and the life I was building in the small town began to feel like more than just an escape. It was a beginning. I found myself cherishing the simplicity of my days, the way they unfolded without the constant hum of tension or betrayal. The forest trails I walked in the mornings felt like old friends, their paths familiar yet ever-changing with the seasons. The cafe had become my go-to spot for quiet moments of reflection, and the bookstore, well, it felt like a second home. Mark's presence there had become a constant, not in a way that overwhelmed, but in a way that grounded me. He had a way of knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. Sometimes we'd spend hours talking about everything and nothing. Other times we'd sit across from each other, both absorbed in our own books, the quiet between us as comfortable as an old sweater. There was no pressure, no expectations, and I realized how much I valued that. After so many years of trying to meet someone else's needs, it was freeing to simply exist without worrying about being enough for someone. One crisp morning, as I sipped my coffee at the cafe, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Emily or another well-meaning friend checking in. It was him. The notification showed only the first few words of the message. "I need to see you." My chest tightened as I stared at the screen. I hadn't heard his voice since that voicemail weeks ago, and I'd ignored every attempt he made to contact me. But something about the tone of this message felt different, urgent, almost desperate. Against my better judgment, I opened it. "Please, just one conversation. I know I've ruined everything, but I can't let it end like this." I set the phone down, my hands trembling slightly. A part of me wanted to delete the message and pretend I hadn't seen it, to preserve the fragile peace I'd found here. But another part, the part that still carried the weight of unfinished business, wondered if there was something to be gained by facing him. Not for his sake, but for mine. That evening I called Emily to talk it through. She listened patiently as I told her about the message, my voice wavering as I tried to explain the conflict raging inside me. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. "You don't owe him anything," she said firmly. "But if you think it'll help you move on, then maybe it's worth hearing what he has to say. Just promise me one thing. Don't let him manipulate you. Remember how far you've come." Her words stayed with me as I mulled over the decision. In the end, I agreed to meet him, not because I wanted to give him a second chance, but because I needed closure. I needed to hear whatever excuses or apologies he had to offer and decide, once and for all, whether they held any weight. We met in a park on the outskirts of town, a place where the changing leaves painted the landscape in fiery shades of red and gold. He was already there when I arrived, pacing near a bench with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. When he saw me, his face lit up with a mixture of relief and something that looked like hope. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice tentative as I approached. I nodded but didn't respond, keeping a careful distance as I sat on the bench. He hesitated for a moment before sitting beside me, leaving enough space between us to show he understood the boundaries I'd set. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sounds of the park filled the silence, the rustling leaves, the distant laughter of children, the occasional bark of a dog. Finally, he broke the quiet. "I've been a mess without you," he said, his voice low. "I know that doesn't change anything, but it's the truth. I can't stop thinking about what I did, about how I hurt you." I stared straight ahead, my expression unreadable. "Why did you do it?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. "I deserved to know." He ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping. "I don't have a good answer," he admitted. "I think I got complacent. I took you for granted. And then Rebecca came along and she made me feel." He stopped, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter. Nothing excuses what I did. I was selfish and I threw away the best thing I ever had." His words felt rehearsed, polished in a way that made me question their sincerity. But even if they were genuine, they couldn't erase the pain he had caused or the trust he had shattered. "I don't think I can forgive you," I said quietly. Not now. Maybe not ever. He flinched as though I'd struck him, but he nodded. I understand. I needed you to know how sorry I am. And if there's ever a chance. There isn't. I interrupted, my voice steady. I've spent weeks trying to make sense of this, to figure out what I could have done differently. But the truth is, this wasn't about me. It was about you. And I refused to let your mistakes define my life. The weight of my words hung in the air between us, final and unyielding. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then he simply nodded again. His eyes filled with a sadness that no longer felt like my responsibility to fix. As I walked away from the park, I felt lighter, as though I had left something heavy behind. The conversation hadn't given me the answers I thought I wanted, but it had given me something better. The realization that I didn't need them. I didn't need his closure or his redemption. I could create my own. That night I sat by the window in my room, watching the stars blink into existence one by one. For the first time in a long time I felt a sense of peace. Not because everything was resolved, but because I finally understood that resolution didn't have to come from anyone but me. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I was ready to walk it, step by step on my own terms. The following days felt like a quiet exhale, as though I'd been holding my breath for months and was finally learning how to breathe again. Letting go of the weight I'd carried since the moment I found that necklace wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I hadn't expected the confrontation with him to leave me feeling so clear, so certain that the path forward didn't include him. It was as though speaking the words aloud had solidified the resolve that had been quietly growing inside me all along. I threw myself deeper into the rhythm of my new life. The trails I walked each morning felt more vibrant, the air crisp and alive. I began exploring more of the little town, finding hidden corners I hadn't noticed before. A tiny flower shop with bouquets arranged like works of art. A bakery whose warm cinnamon rolls practically melted in your mouth. These small discoveries brought me joy, simple and unadulterated, and I clung to them as proof that happiness could still exist in fragments, even in the aftermath of something so devastating. Mark remained a steady presence in my life, though I often wondered if he understood just how much his quiet kindness had meant to me. We continued to spend hours at the bookstore, our conversations weaving between light-hearted banter and deeper reflections about life, love, and loss. He had an uncanny ability to sense when I needed to talk and when I simply needed to sit in silence, and for that I was grateful. There was no pressure, no expectation, just a gentle companionship that made the world feel a little less heavy. One afternoon, as I sat in the bookstore flipping through a collection of essays, Mark approached with a thoughtful expression. He set a book down in front of me, its cover simple but elegant, the title catching my eye, On Beginning Again. I think you might like this one, he said, his voice warm. It's about finding strength and starting over. I looked up at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of my lips. Are you trying to tell me something? He chuckled softly, his eyes crinkling at the edges. Maybe. Or maybe I just thought it looked like something you'd pick up eventually, and I wanted to save you the trouble. I took the book, running my fingers over the cover. Thank you, I said sincerely. For this. For everything. He waved off the thanks, but I could see the faint flush of color rise to his cheeks. You don't have to thank me, he said. Just don't forget how far you've come. His words lingered in my mind long after I left the shop that day. How far I'd come. It was a phrase I hadn't thought much about, but as I reflected on the past weeks I realized he was right. The woman I was now, the one who walked the trails each morning, who sat by the window each night writing her own story, felt miles away from the woman who had driven out of her old life with a heart full of anger and pain. That night, as I sat in my room with the book he'd given me, I thought about what it truly meant to begin again. It wasn't just about leaving the past behind. It was about embracing the possibility of something new, something better. It was about forgiving myself for the ways I'd lost pieces of who I was and finding the courage to reclaim them, one by one. I started making plans. Nothing grand or overly ambitious. Just small steps toward creating a life that felt like my own. I began looking into freelance opportunities, something that would allow me to work remotely, while staying in the town that had become my sanctuary. I reached out to Emily more often, our conversations a source of comfort, and laughter that reminded me of the importance of having someone who truly knew and cared for me. And then there was Mark. Though our connection had remained firmly rooted in friendship, I couldn't ignore the way my heart felt lighter whenever I was around him. There was something about his presence that made me believe in the possibility of goodness, of trust, even after everything I'd been through. I didn't know if it would ever become more than what it was, but for now, it was enough. One evening, as we sat on the bench outside the bookstore watching the sunset, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Have you ever thought about what's next for you?" he asked, his tone casual but curious. I nodded slowly, the question one I'd been asking myself more and more lately. "I have," I admitted. "I think I want to stay here. At least for a while. This place, it feels like exactly where I need to be right now." His smile was soft, genuine. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "You deserve a place that feels like yours." For the first time in what felt like forever, I believed him. I believed that I deserved this chance to start over, to build something new and beautiful from the pieces of what had been broken. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of gold and pink, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. A reminder that sometimes, the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the freedom to begin again. The decision to stay felt like a homecoming, not to a place but to myself. I officially rented a small cottage on the edge of town, its ivy-covered walls and flower-filled garden, a perfect reflection of the peace I was cultivating within. Moving in was both exhilarating and daunting. It marked the first time in years I was carving out a space that was entirely my own. As I unpacked the few belongings I had brought with me, I found myself smiling at the realization that this place wasn't just a stopgap. It was a new beginning. Life settled into a rhythm that felt organic and unforced. I started freelance work, setting up a cozy corner of the cottage as my office, complete with stacks of books and a view of the garden. My mornings remained sacred, filled with walks through the woods or quiet moments with a cup of tea on the porch. The town continued to feel like a haven, its small joys grounding me in a way I hadn't thought possible. Mark remained a part of my life, though our connection evolved naturally, without pressure or urgency. He was still there, behind the counter at the bookstore, always ready with a new recommendation or a thoughtful conversation. We shared dinners sometimes, laughing over simple meals, and talking about everything from favorite childhood memories to the dreams we were both rediscovering. There was something refreshing about how easy it was to be around him. No masks, no pretense. Just two people finding comfort in each other's company. One evening, as we walked along the trail that bordered the town, he stopped suddenly and turned to me. The golden light of the setting sun painted his face in warm hues, and for a moment, he seemed almost hesitant. "I've been meaning to say something," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "I know you've been through so much, and I never want to push you into anything you're not ready for. But I care about you. A lot. And I think I'd like to see where this could go if you're open to it." His words hung in the air, tender and unassuming. I looked at him, feeling a rush of emotions I hadn't expected. Gratitude, hope, and the faintest flicker of something that felt like trust. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel afraid of letting someone in. "I care about you too," I said softly, a smile breaking through. "And I think I'd like to see where this could go too." It wasn't a declaration of forever, and it didn't need to be. It was a promise to try, to explore the possibility of something new with someone who had shown me what kindness and patience could look like. As we continued walking, the warmth of his hand brushing against mine, I felt something shift within me, a quiet assurance that I was finally on the right path. Months passed, and the life I had built in that small town grew richer with each passing day. The garden at the cottage flourished, a riot of color and life that mirrored my own journey. Emily visited often, her laughter filling the spaces that had once felt empty, and together we celebrated the milestones, big and small, that marked my new beginning. My work blossomed, too, each project a reminder that I could stand on my own 2 feet and thrive. And then there was Mark. He became a constant, not in a way that overshadowed my independence, but in a way that complemented it. We continued to grow together, each step forward rooted in mutual respect and understanding. He wasn't a savior or a solution. He was simply someone who had chosen to walk alongside me. And that was more than enough. Looking back, it was hard to believe how much had changed since the day I found that necklace. What had once felt like the end of everything had become the beginning of something I could never have imagined. A life that was wholly and unapologetically mine. The pain and betrayal I had endured were still a part of my story, but they no longer defined me. They were chapters in a book that was far from finished, a book that I was finally writing on my own terms. One morning, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun rise over the garden, I felt a profound sense of peace. The woman I had been when I first arrived in this town, the one who carried the weight of heartbreak and doubt, felt like a distant memory. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had faced the storm and emerged not unscathed but unbroken. Life, I realized, wasn't about erasing the scars or pretending the pain had never existed. It was about embracing the messy, beautiful truth of it all, and finding joy in the moments that made it worth living. And as I sat there, the warmth of the sun on my face, and the sound of the world waking up around me, I knew without a doubt that I had found my way home.